Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to your Library at Home. My name is Rebecca. I'm part of the Public Programs team at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Gadigal land, the traditional custodians of this land on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales. And I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us online today. On the first Thursday of every month during the season of winter, the State Library partnered with Inspiring Australia to bring to your screens a new series, The Science of Us, a program that brought together scientists, researchers, authors, and academics on topics that help us to understand troubling human behaviour through the prism of science. This talk today is an extension of that program, but is also in celebration of National Science Week, which commenced on the 14th of August and concludes on the 22nd of August 2021. Today's talk could not come at a more appropriate time. Many across the world, across Australia, and especially people across New South Wales are living through a time that is unique, frustrating, and for some quite frightening. And it's important for us to all take the time to recognise that what we're going through is difficult and its effects are varying. While we may not have the opportunities to address all of the concerns that have really come to light since 2020 and the introduction of COVID, having a platform where we can openly and honestly talk about some of these emerging issues and topics is such a valuable tool. And so I'm very pleased today to be welcoming to your screens Dr. Michelle Lim, Professor Catherine Haslam, and Jenny Sager for an exploration on loneliness, its impacts, and of course, some remedies that are available to us. There will be time for questions at the conclusion of today's talk with the panel. So I encourage you all at home to please use the Q&A feature of your Zoom app and type through your questions at any stage. These questions will be moderated at the conclusion of the panel's discussion. We'll try and get through as many questions as we possibly can. Before I introduce the panel to your screen, I would like to introduce now Manager of Inspiring Australia, Jackie Randalls.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and welcome everybody. And thank you so much. We have over 250 people with us today to consider this very important topic, loneliness. And even more important is the science of loneliness. What does it do to us emotionally and physically? And why is it important that we heed these signals and take steps to address loneliness in our community and help those around us as well to connect? In COVID, it couldn't be more apt, as Rebecca said, and I'd like to say a big thank you to the State Library of New South Wales for joining us in National Science Week. We're coming to you again virtually for a second year running, and that's lonely. For all of us who work in the event space, it's really difficult that our jobs, where we were usually out and about all throughout the month of August, connecting with the community, sharing scientific research, we're now doing it online. So I'm very, very grateful for the State Library to join us in the Science of Us. And I'm thrilled to be able to bring you these loneliness researchers who can not only tell us about the science, but also about the evidence-based strategies we can all use to do something about our loneliness. So I'm really looking forward to it too. And to lead the discussion, I'm thrilled to welcome Jenny Sager, who heads up the Neighbourhood app that some of you may be on. And I'll leave it to Jenny to tell you all about it. But Nextdoor's been incredibly active in times of COVID lockdowns in connecting neighbours and getting people really mobilised to help and support each other. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Jenny, and I'm very grateful that you're all here today. Enjoy.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Rebecca, and really, really excited to be here today, especially with two of Australia's premier loneliness experts, both Catherine Haslam and Michelle Lim, both of whom I immensely respect and admire for all of their work in this space of combating social isolation and loneliness. And so just for a quick intro, Catherine, would you like to introduce yourself to everybody, please?
I will. Thanks very much, Jenny. Before I say who I am, I just wanted to say that I'm coming to you from Yagara and Turrbal lands, and I want to acknowledge their ancestors and descendants and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm based in Brisbane, and I've been doing some work I've been working in the area of social disconnection and loneliness probably for about the last 10 to 15 years in a range of different ways, looking at its effect, but also now starting to think about what are things that we can do to manage this. Simple things, but also, more involved things as well.
Excellent, thank you. And Michelle?
Hi, everybody. I'm just, before I start, I am on this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners here over in Melbourne. So I am the chairperson and scientific chair of Ending Loneliness Together, which is a national organization that's focused on addressing chronic loneliness in Australia, but also the co-director of the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection, which is really a network of multiple countries around the world that are kind of acknowledging, coming together to try to better address loneliness and social connection as we are seeing accelerating rates across different parts of the world.
Excellent, and thank you again to both of you for joining us today. And as Michelle just said, loneliness was on the rise before the pandemic hit, and there was a lot of talk about the loneliness epidemic in Australia. Then we got faced with a global pandemic that nobody anticipated, and we found ourselves in even more of a challenging time. And we do want to talk today about some of the practical tips and some of the solutions that people can take away from this session and apply into their own lives. But I think before we get there, we all do a lot of work to break down the stigma of loneliness, and we know that loneliness does not discriminate. And I think it's important for each of us to kick it off and share how loneliness has impacted our own personal lives over the last 12 to 18 months. And so I will start with my own story, obviously being an expat here in Australia. In the middle of the pandemic a few weeks ago, in the middle of the strictest lockdown in Sydney, I actually left the neighborhood I'd been living in for 9 years and moved to a completely other side of town where I don't know anybody. And so finding yourself in very strict lockdown where you don't know anyone presents a whole new challenge with loneliness, and on top of it being isolated from my family overseas. So I think it's been a particularly challenging time. And Michelle, you being based in Melbourne, I know have also faced some really strict lockdowns over the last year. And how has that impacted you personally?
In fact, I think that's a really very interesting question, because I actually have not been to the office at the university since February last year. And, just a few weeks before the World Health Organization announced that this is a pandemic. So, I've been working remotely and really highly value work colleagues in my team. And it's been a very difficult time, especially for university. And many of these colleagues are now being let go, made redundant. Their social network has been destroyed. Whilst I still keep in touch with many of them, because they're more than just a team member now, what I would consider a friend. I think it's been incredibly hard with the challenges of remote working to really find my feet, to really get a sense of shared. Even though it's a shared experience, really to ensure that I stay meaningfully connected to colleagues who no longer work with me. I think it's been a huge challenge, and I hope that as we kind of progress through and recover from this pandemic, that we understand better how to actually manage remote working practices, because it's really something that we've been thrown into.
Absolutely, and it's certainly nothing that's going to stop anytime soon. So yeah, I think it's a challenge we will continue to face for a long time. And Catherine, how about yourself?
Yeah, look, some of my experience have been similar to what you guys have described. I have a lot of overseas colleagues. My family are interstate, but the one sort of thing that made us feel, my partner and I feel more lonely and disconnected from overseas, was that his parents fell ill. This is not a lone experience. There's a lot of people I know who've experienced similar sorts of things. So in the last 12 months, we've lost both my in-laws, and we've had Zoom funerals, which are far from ideal. So I sympathise with a lot of people who've faced similar sorts of dilemmas. And it's these sorts of situations that you want to connect more and be there and share with other people. We are looking forward to the time that borders will open, so that we will be in a position to reminisce more appropriately in a memorial moving forward. So we look forward to that time.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that is really clear with the pandemic is it has truly affected every single person's life. And Michelle, you were obviously studying loneliness a long time before we found ourselves in this situation. How have you seen things change since the pandemic started?
Look, I think it's loneliness is not a new condition per se. It's not, it's not a pathological condition. It's a feeling that we have that's distressing and aversive, but it's really a signal for us to do something different about our relationships. And what I have seen over the last 20 to 30 years is that it's just increasing research that supports that loneliness itself is an independent social determinant of health, above and beyond the impact of social isolation. So, and just for people here who may not know the difference, because sometimes they're used interchangeably, loneliness is very much a subjective feeling of being alone, being socially isolated, whereas social isolation is much more obvious. It's about the number of people you see, the degree of contact you have, perhaps even if you're living alone or you're unemployed, you're more likely to be classified as socially isolated. And in traditional health research, it's been long acknowledged that social isolation actually it's bad for your health and has strong links to mortality and morbidity of disorders, but only in the recent 20 years that we're seeing that it's not just that you're socially isolated, but that if you feel socially isolated, that has equivalent detrimental impacts on your health and well-being. So to say that loneliness is a new thing or a new trend is not. I think it's really that the research is much clearer and growing, and now we've reached to this point where there's robust evidence, but yet our policy and our practice hasn't quite matched up to the evidence. So it's really trying to, the job of Catherine and myself is to try to translate that science into practice and policy.
I mean, I think that the science, as you're saying, Michelle, in terms of sort of building up our knowledge and evidence base to try and understand how it is having that impact. I mean, what we know from that science is that, loneliness has effects on health and mortality that are equivalent to smoking, and it's worse for you than physical inactivity, poor diet, drinking too much. And yet we know that diet, activity, physical activity, obesity, other sorts of issues are public health priorities in Australia, but we haven't made loneliness a public health priority. And if we're talking about comparative results here, we should be. So I think that that's where the science has actually really started moving things ahead. As Michelle has said, loneliness isn't a new phenomenon. It's been around for a long time, but what's raising the stakes is our knowledge of the significant impact it actually has on our health and well-being.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because Nextdoor was created 10 years ago in the US for this exact reason, was to combat social isolation and loneliness at the community level and to cultivate a kinder world where everyone has a neighborhood to rely on. And that was because the co-founders actually looked at the research that showed that those community connections actually then positively impact not only mental health, but physical health, lowering crime rates in neighborhoods, improving test scores, and just building stronger communities. And that's when we start to look at the difference between what psychologists call strong ties and weak ties, which are often used to describe relationships such as your hairdresser, your neighbor, your person who makes your coffee in the morning. And I know, Catherine, you've even mentioned a term called social snacking. So can you explain a little bit about what that means and why those kind of looser ties are important?
Yeah, look, I think that, I kind of think of social snacking, and I think social snacking, when it was originally coined, was to be was to capture those micro interactions that you're actually talking about there, the sorts of things that we did a lot of when we were in the workplace. I know Michelle's actually written about some of this as well. So when you're not in your workplace, you're not experiencing those. And those micro interactions that we have, that kind of sort of, that conversation that we have with a person who's making our coffee, when we're buying our groceries, when we're doing all of those things in everyday life, when we're walking past, they have a really big impact, particularly for people who've experienced loneliness for a long period of time. Because sometimes it can be really challenging to get out there and to do what they think would be really anxiety-provoking things like befriending somebody, joining a new group. Those sorts of things can be a little bit anxiety-provoking. And so these sorts of micro interactions and social snacking is a way of trying to build up to that. And I think that, look, it's important that that we engage in those interactions, because they hold us, particularly in periods of pandemic when it's really difficult to connect, and the opportunities to connect aren't as strongly out there. But I think it's also important for us to think about the other types of interactions that we have. Those interactions that we have with other people who are like important others in our lives, like a spouse, a best friend. Meeting up with them is important. And a lot of our work, we really focus very much on that sense of community belonging. So we focus very much with myself and my team here at the University of Queensland, focusing on group belonging. Your sense of connection with your family, with your neighbourhood, with the interest groups, with your book club, with your arts groups, with your sporting groups, with your walking groups, or whatever floats your boat. All of those interactions are actually really important, and each of them make a different contribution to keeping your health and well-being together. And in particular, some of our work has actually shown that it's group-based connections that we often forget at times or take for granted, but that do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to keeping us mentally alert and active and happy for longer. So all of these interactions are really important. And the reason why I'm sort of focusing on all of them rather than prioritizing one over the other is that all of them give us opportunities to connect. The more of them that we have, it gives us more opportunities to take advantage of connection. And so I think it's important to think and strategically think about the different ways that we actually connect with others that work for us, because different ways of connecting will work for different people.
Absolutely. There's so many different ways, especially now as technology continues to evolve. Michelle, we did some research last year looking at the importance of neighborly connections and community connections, where we found that just connecting with 6 neighbors actually starts to have a positive impact on mental health and well-being. Why do you think that community connection is important?
Look, I think even taking one step back is that, the Australian Loneliness Report was showing that, Australians don't have neighborhood connections, that they really rely on. I think at least 1 in 2 Australians don't know their neighbors. And I think that is really an untapped community source of support. We're not too bad at reaching out to friends, to family, but when it comes to neighbors, it's embarrassing. Many people don't know their neighbors, and I think during the time of COVID, and this was especially really kind of much more apparent, is that when in Melbourne we couldn't leave more than 5 kilometers from our house during the second lockdown, and if you didn't know your neighbors, you're in big trouble. And we in fact did a study on during that time, what's the impact of even just showing acts of kindness to a neighbor, and these forms of kindness, they don't cost you anything. It's about saying hi, checking in, giving us making sure your neighbor actually has all the resources they need. And it was really interesting what people were choosing to do during the pandemic, and how people actually stepped out. And most people across different countries that we looked at were doing around 2.6 act of kindness, actually specific discrete actions where they were actually trying to help a neighbor. And the fact that, there was an acceleration towards how we assisted as well. And that kind of modality change, from face-to-face to much more online. And Jenny, you can speak much more to the stats around, the acceleration of Nextdoor during this time, and how people had to change their social behaviors and change their social routines in order to get as much social connection as they could, and to try to mitigate the effects of loneliness during this time.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite things about my job is that we see the actual proof that kindness is contagious, right? It's like, these small acts of kindness, when one person starts doing it, you definitely see that domino effect where it's easy to kind of latch on to the kind movement, I would say. Michelle, I know you've also done some research into the loneliness as it relates to the younger population as well. And I just wanted to touch on that because, again, I think there's often a stigma with loneliness that it's just an aging population or an older population that faces this, which we know is absolutely not true. Could you just give us a little bit of insight into the research you've done with loneliness and the impact on the younger population as well?
Yeah, and I think it also goes beyond some of the Australian data that we're noticing. In fact, we see this in international studies as well, that there are two peaks of loneliness, of vulnerability to loneliness. One, which is around the 18 to 25 age range, and the other one over 75. And there's some inconsistent findings just depending on the sample, that we look at, because different samples sometimes indicate slightly different vulnerable groups. But what we do find is that the 18 to 25 in particular are more at risk, but also it is possible that this emerging mental illness layered on top of this. They're also, as Catherine knows very well, trying to find who they are. They don't have a strong sense of social identity, moving from their parents' home into a new stage of life where they have to be independent, living maybe perhaps with housemates, peers, having to deal with people from different age groups as well is a bit of a challenge. And we do know that loneliness and social anxiety, for example, so a fear of negative evaluation, a fear of, of being judged, those sorts of symptoms related to mental health is very much highly prevalent as well in young people. So what many mental health professionals have done occasionally to try to better engage young people is actually trying to engage them on digital platforms, because we do know that young people are really highly competent, highly confident in using these tools, but they use them almost as a transitional tool so that to get them comfortable so that they can then make the transition to some face-to-face interactions. And that's very common in youth mental health research. And youth mental health has been doing this fantastic work in digital tools for years and years and years. And we, whilst the mainstream kinds of tools don't always promote quality relationships, they do connect the young person to many. So what we're trying to do here is to try to shift as well the focus of young people to say it's not about the number of friends you have, but the quality of the friends you have. So how can we actually use these tools to our advantage, not disadvantage, to actually nurture those relationships? And how do you pick those ones? And it's really an interesting time for young people, because many of them right now are so used to technology, and from an older person's perspective, it's always, the main common complaint is let's blame social media, let's blame all these tools. But it's really about how we use them and how we can use them to our advantage. That's really more important for us to think about.
I think that in terms of those tools, Michelle, you're really right to kind of sort of highlight how you utilize them. So there's also some interesting research. I'm the Australian Talk Starter, and some of the people listening today would have taken part in those surveys. Really supports exactly what you've been saying, that young people are particularly vulnerable. In addition to people who are experiencing vulnerability and socioeconomic disadvantage, vulnerability through illness and things like that, chronic conditions. But some other interesting research is obviously sort of, the pandemic has raised the stakes on, if you can't see people in person, let's go virtual and let's keep on going virtual. And I think that we need to use those in meaningful ways. So for instance, there's some research by sociologists that highlighted that for older people, people who just really focus very much on the virtual, if they did more of that, that wasn't good for their mental health, and it made them feel more lonely. But the people who were the best off, this is people who are like 60 years plus, what they found is that the people who did the best in terms of had less loneliness and the best mental health were the people who had a good balance of both. They used the virtual connections and social media in ways that was meaningful for them, and they did it in moderation. So they still had a balance of some of those in person. So it's about, like you said, using these things as tools so that one doesn't overrun the other, but they're used for me in meaningful ways to help people feel connected. If it's not meaningful, it's probably not going to be doing the trick.
Yeah, look, I love that you say that. And actually, I've heard anecdotally, there were people at the start of the pandemic, they were so worried about losing connection. Some of them would turn on their Zoom all the time with family members, and they might be just working. And then they found after a while, it's like, oh, this is not working for me because we're not really meaningfully engaged. These tools are being used, but they were just running 24/7 just because they didn't want to feel alone. But actually, it didn't help at all. So I think it's really about how do we actually utilize these tools to our advantage that works for you. And again, Kath is making, kind of some statements around age groups, and within those age groups there will be people with differing needs as well. So it's about how do you want to use these tools, what's accessible to you, and if it doesn't work for you, it's okay to try something else. It doesn't have to, and during this time, even in Victoria's strictest lockdown, we're still able to say hi to the neighbor over the fence with a mask on. So that and we're still able to do things, creative things like write letters, write notes, send care packages. So, if those digital, tools, or maybe some people just, want to mix, or they're just sick of those digital tools. There's so many other kind of creative ways for us to connect and to actually build those meaningful relationships. And perhaps you may not know your neighbor very well, but kind of building that over time through little actions like that, I think will really make a difference.
I think there's some really key words there. Balance, meaningful connections are something that we talk about a lot, the difference between those and kind of superficial connections. So the balance and the meaningful connections. And I think I love your point about the creativity. That's the silver lining that's come out of being in this pandemic. And we've certainly seen a lot of, virtual book clubs start, for example, or things, I'm really into baking. I'm in a baking group that kind of brings me joy every week. And so I think looking for those little bits and pieces that you can find that translate into those meaningful connections is really important. What are some of the warning signs that people can look out for? I think sometimes it can be hard to see when your friends or family or colleagues are struggling with loneliness or social isolation if they don't come out and say it to you. So what are some things that people can look out for?
One of the things that, I think that there are two ways that people can, respond. So it might be that they want to spend more time with other people. And so that might certainly be, they're wandering closer to the fence, wanting to have contact, but not necessarily saying that they're feeling in any way disconnected. And then you can have the other experience of that, as we were discussing earlier on, feeling ashamed of feeling the way that you do. Feeling ashamed about feeling lonely because other people aren't feeling lonely, right? And then that causes people to withdraw. So if somebody is reaching out and wanting to make connection, then yes, absolutely. I think that that's very much along the lines of those acts of kindness, and let's connect in safe ways, like having a quarantine over the fence or something like that, so that you maintain things but still have that contact. But if there is somebody that, like, a local neighbor who's withdrawing, that's going to be a telltale sign, and trying to find other ways of trying to connect, picking up the phone, other ways. And what other research has actually highlighted is that, we all go through life changes throughout life. Some are good, some, and that we plan, and some are less good, changing, starting school, starting university, starting a new job, moving cities, moving towns, as you have, Jenny, divorce, bereavement. What we know is that life changes increase your vulnerability to loneliness. So if you also know that somebody is experiencing some of these life changes, that to me is also just a little bit of a flag to let's just monitor and let's see what we can do to actually be there for support.
Yeah, and I would also add, I love your points, Kath, because actually that's exactly, the experience of a lot of people is that they'll rarely say I'm lonely. They will try to make what we call soft, indirect kind of edges towards needing social connection. So they might be very indirect. So they might say something like, hey, Jenny, if you're free, love to catch up. But if you're not, it's fine, on your time, kind of that very soft ask, or complete withdrawal, which is they're just not able to ask directly, or sometimes even not understanding, and that's actually what they're experiencing. And there could be a lot of shame layered on top of that. And part of having this conversation is really to make loneliness, or the word loneliness, less stigmatized, more normalized. That if someone says, I feel lonely, you ask, oh, what is it that, I can do to help, and not assuming that what helps you will help the other person. Because again, social needs are so complex and so nuanced. Everyone's got different kinds of thresholds in terms of what they need to feel meaningfully connected. And this can relate all the way from their brain, their biology, their mental health status, the social context in which they're in, their socioeconomic status, and what kind of resources they can gather. What might work for you may not work for someone else. So really just asking those open questions, like, what is it that I can do to help? Or maybe perhaps it's usually just a listening ear, no judgment. What is it that they think could help them? Again, because they know themselves, the best possible way. So getting them to reflect those things, as opposed to saying, oh, you have to join a group. Go and join a singing group. You'll feel better, because that really trivializes the issue and simplifies it. Simplifies a fairly, complex and subjective experience, and makes it, I guess it's this idea that it's a simple thing to resolve, but we do know that, multiple things lead to loneliness as opposed to one thing. So giving that person the space is really just the start.
And what do you both see are the main barriers for people not taking action? Is it that they just don't know what to do? Is it that they're nervous they'll do the wrong thing? Like, what kind of stops people from actually trying to help others that they know are struggling with loneliness?
I think that for people themselves, one of the things that we often have people say is that they don't know where to start, particularly if you've been experiencing loneliness for a fair bit of time. And it might not have been something, it might have happened because of a life change, an illness, you've moved at the same time, and it's been a struggle to actually get things up and running. And then it's almost become even harder to then take the next step. That, coupled with a little bit of anxiety, are people going to like me? Am I going to be accepted? All of those things can actually make it challenging. That on top of the stigma that we've talked about. I think that it's great that we're talking about this openly, and I think that the pandemic has helped us to raise awareness of this. But I think people are still feeling that, why is it that it's me that's hitting this? Why is it that I'm experiencing this? When I think it's much more of a societal and wider issue rather than an individual issue. So I think that that's where programs like yours, Jenny, social prescribing activities where, people are being supported in communities by NGOs, charities, groups like the Men's Shed, Salvation Army, who are offering different types of activities. As Michelle was basically saying, not any group will do. That's not the case. You have to find something that that's going to float your boat, something that is going to give your life meaning, purpose, and value. And it's those groups and those connections that are going to do the heavy lifting when it comes to protecting your health and well-being in the longer term. So sometimes it's a matter of connecting with some of those organisations where there might be support people who can actually help you make the link, some of the practical hands-on stuff. But we've also developed a program at UQ, University of Queensland, Groups for Health, where we try and empower people. We try and work with people to start getting them to think about, well, if I were going to be connecting with a group to support my health and well-being, what could they be? And what would be the right ones for me? And how would I go about it? And how can I practice some of those sorts of skills, which we do as part of the group? So there are different ways and different strategies that are out there. we need to help people and resource people to go down the path that works for them. And I think that's the challenge, and something that Ending Loneliness Together is really trying to prioritize. You know, how do we actually try and draw all of these resources together so we make it easier for people to make those connections?
I'm going to add to Kath's point, and you know, her points are fantastic. But I'm kind of thinking about some of the barriers on the kind of meso level, the societal level. Going back to the community solutions, I think there are a lot of well-intended service providers out there that has been doing, it has been working this area for a very long time, but in many cases, they actually do a much better job in reducing social isolation and not loneliness. So it's about augmenting the care and the frameworks that guides their work. You know, what is it that we can do to take it beyond just reducing social isolation? Because there's a lot more obvious. We can increase the number of people you know, we can increase your social contact, but can we help you also nurture those meaningful social connections? So to support these community organizations who've been doing this work for a very long time, to augment what they're really delivering. So we don't have to change everything, but to modify so that they can improve those services, and also to measure loneliness, because not everyone does. They do say, oh, we reduce loneliness and social isolation, but actually measuring and understanding the impact is not always there. But also, how do we kind of inform policies that, you know, govern the way we live and work, you know, especially if remote working, for example, is coming into play now. You know, what are the key ingredients do these organizations and policies need to include, so that it's not just us saying hi, and being less socially isolated, but that we can actually build those meaningful social connections with our colleagues or with our line managers, or and in our schools. So how do we better prepare young people for that transition from high school all the way to further employment or university or further training? What is it that we're doing to equip young people? And in a very much larger scale than just one organization doing this, but really the government kind of implementing these evidence-based frameworks so that we can better support communities make those social transitions. And you could argue the same for any social transitions. Older Australians are always good at doing financial planning. What about social planning? So those sorts of things. I think they are all barriers. It's all work to be done, but it's only by working together with academics, with industry practice, with government, that we can really make an effective impact.
And there's a great question that's just come in from somebody who's watching, which relates directly to this. And the question being, with such a multicultural society here in Australia, how does that actually, and how does their cultural background and the influences around that actually affect that vulnerability to loneliness and social isolation? I know, for example, on Nextdoor, we have an immense amount of cultural groups and ethnic groups that form on Nextdoor, where they're looking for those people near them that they can connect with, that share that cultural background, because they are feeling separate from that local society. And so it'd be great to hear some thoughts from both of you on that as well.
Yeah, well,
I'm happy. Oh, you go, Kath. We're so excited.
Oh yeah, well, but I think that's a really good point. So some of the work that a team have been doing here at University of Queensland has been looking at older people in that in called populations and in that transition, and there's different ways that people find to connect. So some people want to really invest in their families and find that a way of sort of maintaining some of those connections as they age in Australia after they've moved. Other people really like to seek out connections with the wider community, and there are organisations like Diversicare that we've actually been working with, who provide access and resource people to come together in their ethnic groups, but also in their multi-ethnic groups. So to share cultures, not just to spend time with people of your own culture. And so what we found in that research is that different people seek different ways of connecting. Some like to use that as a basis to connect with their own culture. Some people like to connect with their own culture as well as others. And some have actually used that as a platform to connect more with their own Australian neighbours and neighbourhood. So there's ways and means to actually use those cultural connections. They're very rich connections that we can benefit from. Not only people from culturally and linguistically diverse populations, but we as Australians can also benefit from them too. So thinking about ways in which we can actually connect there. I'm sure Michelle has other work that she can bring in here too. So
look, I think it's really that we haven't done enough, and this space needs more attention. We need significant funding to do the work, because different cultures bring together even different understanding of what loneliness is. And how we have been measuring loneliness has been always in the very Western context, and I can be sure that the questions that we ask in some of these standardized tools are fairly the same if it's the UK, Australia, and the USA, because it's not too, too much difference. But if I had to bring this to Japan or to a different culture or different context, do the questions actually tap into the same construct? I don't know. So this actually requires us to build good tools for people from all backgrounds. And I think that it involves things like, understanding what loneliness is to them. How do you start those conversations? So we really got to kind of take it one step back to just get the assessment correct. There's also research that says, there's a lot of strengths that some of these groups may bring, so that they are supporting each other a lot more. And the differences might be around the different generations of migrants, for example, or if they're perhaps it's not so much that they're from a particular multicultural group, but perhaps sometimes it might be related to having fewer resources financially. So how do we then better support some of these groups to actually engage more within their communities, but also outside their communities?
Excellent, thank you. There's another question that's come in from somebody watching. Is loneliness more likely to be associated with extroverts than introverts? And is there any correlation there?
Well, the data that I've looked at is around personality traits, and there's some, I think, quite consistent data. Catherine, I might be wrong, so correct me. But there's a lot of consistent data generally that extroversion does help with lower levels of loneliness.
I think so I think that there is some of that evidence, but there's also it's encapsulated with wider evidence as well. And so we've tried to have a look at some of these personality variables, because this is a question that comes up on a regular basis. And yes, there are some studies that have actually highlighted that feeling a little bit more outgoing, tends to be associated with feeling more open and willing to try out sort of different connections and connecting with people in different ways. The interesting thing that we found is that on its own doesn't actually explain as much of what's going on in terms of people's experiences. I have to say the biggest predictor that we found in terms of, isn't necessarily personality alone. It tends to be lack of opportunity, poverty, inequality, disability. These are the things that we're finding are having much more of a predictive, they're strong predictors of loneliness, if experiencing loneliness. So I think that there are multiple factors that kind of come into play, and we need to be mindful of them all, and particularly the ones that we can do stuff about. So, poverty and inequality, it's not Michelle and I who've been going on about this. The social determinants of health approach has been going on for decades, modeling this, epidemiologists have been looking at this for a long time, highlighting that we can change this. If we reduce the levels of inequality between groups in our society, we can therefore have these other health-related effects, and I would argue too, these better impacts in the loneliness space.
Is it all gloom and doom in Australia? Like, I know we're coming up to our last few questions, and I always like to end on a hopefully positive note, but is it, are we that much worse off than countries that you would put at a similar scale to us economically and population wise? Like, are we in a place that is actually worse than our kind of global peers as far as when it comes to loneliness? Are we better? Are we kind of middle? And is there anything that Australia is doing right?
That's a huge question, because it involves us trying to compare apples to apples, which, as we know, is not the case, because Australia has very specific kind of demographic factors that might change things. University healthcare, for example, is not non-existent in the US, which can actually increase inequality. From my perspective, I actually think that we've got the knowledge, and that's us arming ourselves for and future-proofing ourselves against negative effects of loneliness. The fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that I've got a wonderful scientific team sitting behind Ending Loneliness Together, I've got industry partners and government kind of listening about this issue, means that we're actually taking that step closer to making change. And this kind of work is ongoing. It's not something that we do and we knock off and cross off our list because we did something small. It's more about that wider collaboration, tapping into resources globally that would actually make the difference. So I feel hopeful. I know loneliness is not a pleasant topic to talk about, but the fact that we are talking about it, we have wonderful, wonderful people working on this agenda, from academia to industry practice, tells me that we will find ways to mitigate the ill effects of loneliness, if not in the short term, definitely in the long term.
If I can just kind of echo some of what Michelle is saying, but also say that, look, we're not worse than other countries. I think that some of the things that the data are showing in Australia are very similar in other countries. So, the experience of loneliness, young people and people facing inequality and disability, those sorts of rates are probably similar. But let me echo what Michelle was actually saying there. This is something, because this is similar, because these are issues that people internationally are grappling with, then we should be using best practice. We should be drawing on the best practice from all of these different areas, but also we should be drawing on all of those resources as an international coalition, which is what Michelle is actually trying to lead here. It isn't just about Australia sort of making its gains. We definitely want to sort of have that element, but we want to sort of have an international face on this one as well. And helping us to do that is going to have to be, making sure that we get government along with this story. Now, Queensland is currently just about to close on its loneliness inquiry, close its submissions. So submissions are closing tomorrow, and it's recognising, as are other states, Victoria, South Australia. There are people in government who are really wanting to make this a priority, so that we deal with this, because loneliness does not have to be. And that's, so we can change this. I think that's the positive thing. We've got the initiative, we've got the creativity, we've got the interest. We just have to get government and others just to come along with us on this ride.
And as part of the challenge, and there's a question that's just come in that relates to this a bit as well, is part of the challenge that it's often can be difficult to separate loneliness from other mental health issues. So we hear a lot about other mental health issues, both at the government level and the health level, and also day to day, whether that's depression or suicide, and lots of things that loneliness could also be a driving cause and effect of. And so it's part of the challenge that we all have on our hands, separating those out.
I think it's a positive and a negative at the same time, because it really depends on who you're talking about. Having worked in public mental health and private mental health for the last 18 years, I would echo some of the questions that we have actually in the Q&A section, that actually loneliness predicts poorer mental health outcomes over time, but also those with mental health, current kind of mental health problems or diagnosis actually also report loneliness. And we need to do better as mental health clinicians to address loneliness in people with mental health problems. And I think that, loneliness is an issue that cuts across sectors, because then you could say, very similar things about older adults. Loneliness predicts higher or acceleration of cognitive decline, but also present in people with Alzheimer's disease. So it's about trying to leverage off different sectors and understand how, loneliness, really, to me, the huge value is around the preventative space, because we know it does lead to poorer outcomes. But what we tend to do, whether it's mental health clinicians or, policymakers, is we tend to deal with the hard end things. We will only deal with things when people suicide. We will only deal with things when people are really unwell. And that's really very difficult. And it's not as attractive to deal with it in the early ends of things, where we can prevent these things, even though it makes economic sense. It makes clear economic sense that addressing loneliness early will mitigate the effects of many detrimental outcomes to begin with down the line. But we really need to start shifting our focus to not always just address loneliness when it's actually in a difficult point of view, in a kind of more severe end.
I know we're coming up on time, and I do want to give everyone some clear practical tips to take away with them today. So if you could both share maybe your top 1 or 2 tips of if you're going to leave here today and do something either to help with your own loneliness struggles or to help somebody that is struggling with loneliness, it'd be great if you could share some of your top practical tips.
So probably for me is like, check in on yourself and check in on others. So to check in on yourself, one of the things that we're hoping to do is to just share in chat a link to a brief online activity that just gets you thinking about your social group connections and different ways in which you can connect if you're finding it challenging to connect in person, which the pandemic certainly is adding, making it difficult, but also even at times when, when we might not be in pandemic and you might have easing of restrictions, how do you kind of sort of do that? So this activity and the link to that activity will just get you thinking a little bit about that, checking in on how you're doing yourself and giving you a couple of goals. But as Michelle and you, Jenny, have already said, check in on others. Just really simple, phone somebody you haven't spoken to for a while, touch base with a neighbour. Those sorts of things will provide, just doing those check-ins are things that you can do just very quickly alongside the other things that we've actually been talking about as well.
I'll add to Kath's tips and kind of complement them. Being responsive to the self-indirect approaches that you might get. Actually being open when someone says, "Oh, do you have time?" Actually say, "Yes, I will make the time." And this is really a tip to the people who can help and the people that live around individuals who might be lonely, because I often say, and I joke, is that, well, if you're not lonely now, you will be at some point. So let's try to help others while we can and model that good behavior. But also just being open about not telling the lonely person just to do what you think might work, getting them, you need to be open about the different kinds of things that might work for them. Remembering that loneliness is a subjective experience. So asking the right questions and getting them to think about what would work for them is much better than actually telling them what will work for them. So really, I think my 2 tips kind of trying to lay on the people who could help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Such good takeaways. And I just want to thank you both again for all of your hugely valuable insights today and for your time. It's certainly not an issue that's going to go away anytime soon. And we're so lucky that we have two people like you fighting the fight every day to help make the situation better in Australia. So thank you again for your time and for your knowledge. And I think Rebecca is going to close this out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time this afternoon. A great chat, a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we can't always get to everything, but thank you so to everyone for taking the time to join us online and to really participate and get involved. A reminder all as well that you know, while many of our physical spaces that are closed that normally afford us a place to escape to, including the State Library being closed, I'd like to recognise that teams across the library are working really hard to continue to add content online, providing platforms for people to come together to share stories, hear stories, learn, and connect in some way. So I encourage you all to keep an eye on our website for those upcoming content changes and additions. A quick plug as well, obviously, we have one more talk in the Science of Us program for 2021. Again, it will be hosted online this Thursday, the 19th of August at 11:30 a.m. Details of this event can be found on the State Library website and also the National Science Week website. But we're welcoming Dan Lubman AM, who will be talking to us on the science of addiction and how we can start to begin to change some unhealthy habits. So please join us online for that. Please have a look at the National Science Week website as well if you haven't already. So much happening around Australia to celebrate. But thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you, Jenny, Michelle, and Catherine. And I would like to, on behalf of the library, just, you know, I very much hope that everyone at home watching, your loved ones and your family and your friends are all keeping safe and well. We all hope to see everybody on the flip side of the pandemic, hopefully as soon as possible. Thank you all again for your time.
Thanks, everybody.